everyone, it's Seiji, and welcome to episode 7 of Otaku Field Notes. So, as per usual, I have a lot to talk about, so yeah, let's just get right to it. We're going to be starting off with some anime, and one thing I'm wondering is if anyone has seen the anime called BARAOU no Souretsu or Requiem of the Rose King, because I watched a couple of episodes and it's kind of bad. So this is actually an adaptation of a shoujo manga created by Kanno Aya, which was loosely based on the plays of Richard III and Henry VI by William Shakespeare. So the story takes inspiration from British history as it's set during medieval times during the War of the Roses. So during that time, there were two factions within the royal house that held the English throne. One was the House of Lancaster, the Red Rose, and the other was the House of York, the White Rose. Now, both of them were claiming the right to the crown, and so for roughly 3 decades or so, war was waged between the two. The anime series itself centers around Richard of the House of York, and this is the third son of Richard III. Richard is a troubled teen as his life has been marked by his mother's rejection. From birth, she labeled him a demon child because he's intersex. Despite this, however, he is actually his father's favorite, and he believes that he can actually achieve happiness or some sort of salvation by helping his father become king, since his father always said that the crown comes with a lot of things. What those things are, I don't think he defined. But in any case, that is the main premise. I had heard about the manga when the anime adaptation was announced, and I was very excited because, you know, relative to shonen, not a lot of shoujo pieces get adapted nowadays, and this anime especially seemed to be very promising since the manga had apparently been received very warmly for many years. The manga actually concluded, I think, back in January with a total of like 17 volumes. And so given the total amount of volumes of this manga, I was very surprised to see that the anime only consisted of 24 episodes because, yeah, how are you going to do that? Like, usually an anime episode covers at best 3, maybe 4 chapters of a manga. So how did they expect to shove 17 volumes worth of content into 24 episodes? I don't know. I ended up watching the first 2 episodes and oh my gosh, this anime, as expected, went just at literal breakneck speed. It was far too fast for me to even follow. So the anime actually starts in the middle of a war between the houses, and you get introduced to so many familial and non-familial relationships, and the amount of characters and relationships between these characters is so astoundingly much or many and just too complex to grasp. Like, it took me a full episode to realize who Richard's mother exactly was, because I first thought that she had died and that Richard had a half-brother. I mixed up Henry VI and Edward of Lancaster for like the 2 episodes that I watched. It was just a complete mess, and I have yet to read the manga, but I could just tell that they were skipping over a ton of stuff. And so I actually went to Mal and looked at some of the discussions, actually the discussions of episode 1 and 2, and apparently they tried to adapt the first volume, like the entire volume, in the first episode, which is like completely bonkers, especially if you think about the subject matter, right? This is about a war with so many people, also so many people with the same names like Richard and Edward, the third, the second, the fifth, and it's just not viable, I think, to do that. From what I saw, the anime had such violent time skips, it was very hard to even catch them. Like, there was one moment where Richard was getting locked up by his mother in one of their towers, and then the next moment he's in some random house with the heir of Lancaster. Like, the pacing was so awful. I feel almost obliged to read the manga now, because even without having read it, I can see that they really did this story dirty. And that's also the impression that I got from the fans of the series. Also, one thing that I noticed and wanted to mention was how shonen-like Richard's character was. Like, he has a lot of features that you often see in shonen main characters, which actually quite surprised me. I mean, he's very stubborn and single-minded. You know, he's always repeating whatever his dad said like it's gospel. But regardless of that, I don't actually have like much of an opinion. I actually don't think I should have, since I've only seen 2 episodes of the anime. But in any case, I do see potential in the show. It would be nice to watch his character really develop and see him confront a lot of the things he's struggling with internally. But yeah, it's just kind of a shame seeing that when you actually have like this very popular shoujo manga and it gets adapted, but it's done so poorly, it's very saddening. But yeah, I will come back to this because I really do want to give this manga a go. Anyway, an anime that I actually finished watching was Crying Freeman. So this is an adaptation of a seinen manga created by Koiku Kazuo. The anime started running right after the original manga series ended in 1988. So it consists of 6 episodes, and all of them are actually rather long. They usually hit around the 50 minute mark, and they also came out quite sporadically, so about 1 or 2 years in between each episode. Why? I don't really know. But yeah, it ran from 1988 up until 1994, which is quite interesting, especially when you're having that in the back of your mind whilst watching these episodes back to back. So, let me fill you in on the premise of the series. So, the story centers around Crying Freeman. Originally, he was just known as an ordinary Japanese potter by the name of Hinomura Yo. Then, at some point, when showcasing his work at an exhibition, he finds that a roll of photo tape, like, how would you call this? Like the negatives? He finds a roll in one of his vases, and when he develops the photographs, he finds images of torture. It turns out that these are from a Chinese crime and drug syndicate called the 108 Dragons. They request to get those images back, but Yor refuses and tells them that he's going to call the cops. Which obviously doesn't work. I mean, they're a crime syndicate. But yeah, they end up capturing Yo, and they find him to actually be a very fine specimen for the purpose of creating a human killing machine. And so they do this weird acupuncture stuff in his neck, which... okay, stay with me here. Essentially brainwashes him to kill. But not just kill anyone. He's brainwashed to kill specific targets that he's being assigned to kill by the syndicate. So he can't resist all these commands, but every time after killing his target, he regains his autonomy, and that's when he weeps for the people he's just killed. And so here's the thing, right? You know he's a man, and that he's not free, but wants to be free. And that he cries when he kills people. And so that's why he's a crying Freeman. Wait, that doesn't make sense because he's not free. So it should be Crying Not Freeman. But yeah, the series, he's referred to as Crying Freeman. I guess when he cries, he's free. The anime is set well over a decade after him getting brainwashed, and he's become actually the head of the crime syndicate, and essentially he has just accepted his fate now, to the point where there doesn't really seem to be much of, or actually any type of reluctance when it comes to offing people. He still cries though, so he's still crying Freeman. Okay, so anyway, the first episode was actually surprisingly good. I know it was like a bit dramatic, but I actually kind of liked the theatrics of it all. It had a lot of things in common with, like, you know, your dramatic shoujo anime, and I don't know, I just think that that's really appealing to me. So this episode mainly centers on how Freeman meets his wife and how they are ready to start a life together. The structure of this episode, in my opinion, was very solid. The pacing was really good. There was a lot of like action, cool action scenes, and a lot of graphic violence as well. You know, people get stabbed and shot, so much so that in like the first like 15 minutes or so, I really like flinched a good couple of times because of the violence and gore, because I wasn't really expecting that. But other than that, yeah, it was just great. Even that was like really great. And so, you know, I was left with a lot of excitement for the next episode. Now, I don't know what the heck happened in that 1 year between the creation of the first episode and the second episode, or like if it wasn't even that, like the production or anything, or it was just like the source material. But this show just went off the rails. Horrible. It was so bafflingly bad compared to the first episode. I was completely shook. And, you know, I was thinking about the best way to actually explain to you why I felt that it was just so abominable. And I figured rather than just going over episode, I'd just go over the things that just vexed me to the core of my being. So, a quick recap of what the last 4 episodes are about. Each kind of covers Freeman and the 108 dragons being in a kerfuffle with, like, some other crime group or a random bad guy or just someone seeking revenge. So my major issue with this series is just how freaking goofy it is. It was so bad at times that it became laughable. First point in case is the character called Bayashan, who is the granddaughter of the former heads of the 108 dragons. She is initially introduced as an enemy since she wanted to be the head of the group but wasn't allowed because succession doesn't go by blood. She gets defeated at the end of the second episode, after which she becomes one of Freeman's most loyal followers actually. And throughout the anime, she just gets used as comic relief, but in such a weird way. So Bayashan is like 7 feet something, very big, with the emotional intelligence and instability of like a 3-year-old. First off, the main joke is kind of like, haha, she's fat and ugly, trollololol, to the point where, you know, like for instance, there are people watching her on a security tape and they just start digging into her, like how disgusting she is. Then also, she always gets put in these really weird scenes. Like after she gets defeated by Freeman and decides to join them, he and his wife kind of start treating her like some kind of dog. Like, I don't know, like there's this one point where his wife and her are taking a bath together, and then as a joke, she starts licking Freeman's wife's nipples and proceeds to motorboat her? Like, what? Huh? Like, how did we get here? Like, they're all just like, haha, fun girl time. Like, is that really what y'all be doing? Then one time the group tries to escape from this remote island, and so they end up escaping by helicopter. But because Baya-chan can't fit into the helicopter, they make her run on the ground almost completely naked, save for like her underwear, and they tie a rope around her so that when the helicopter goes higher, they can just like lift her up or something. Which is just like so questionable. Like, why did this have to happen? And you might be wondering, like, why did Baya-chan have to be naked for this? And the thing is, almost all characters are almost always naked. It's so weird. There's also no explanation for it. Like, they're about to have a knife fight and they're just like, let me take off my clothes. About to infiltrate an island filled with enemies? Let me just strip out of all of my clothes. Going to snipe someone? Best to do this virtually naked. Like, like, especially, it's so weird, especially because their opponents usually are fully dressed. And they're just like, I don't need these freaking clothes. All the women do this, but Freeman does this as well, which, you know, I appreciate it. Because oftentimes with like these 80s, 90s movies that are like saying, like targeted towards adult men, it's often just only the women who are naked or sexualized. And, you know, this time we also get to see some men. So, you know, equality? I don't know, but maybe it's just because all of them have like all these tattoos on their bodies and they want to show them off because that's like kind of like the what would you call it? Like the characteristic of the 108 dragons. Like everyone has tattoos. And, you know, I will give them credit for that though, because most of the tattoos looked really good on their bodies. But yeah, there's just so much more goofy stuff that happened in the series. There was, for instance, this one chick who was out for revenge because Freeman killed her lover. She's a white woman, and in order to not get detected, she ends up pulling off a reverse white chicks, and this works, and eventually it leads to her battling with Freeman on top of his submarine. So they're having, you know, a nice little knife fight, and all of a sudden she starts dancing ballet on top of the submarine. Eventually, she manages to successfully attack Freeman and they both land in the water. However, while Freeman went down, he nicked the woman in her wrist, which led to her eventually bleeding out in the water. And so her last words go something like, "Kiss me and stick your tongue down my throat so I can bite it off and we can die together." And so Freeman gives her a kiss, she dies, and lets her body sink to the bottom of the water. Which, yeah, very dramatic. But also, sir, you have a wife. And so this brings me to my other point that I thought was kind of weird, and that is Freeman's infidelity. His entire character development throughout the anime was just awful because it essentially undid everything what was established in the first and also best episode. So, like I said, that one was all about him finding his wife and it seemingly being true love. What happened was that his wife witnessed Freeman killing like a ton of people, and so she figures that he's going to assassinate her as well. She's 29, however, and still a virgin, and so when he enters her room to kill her, she tells him to read her diary and fulfill this one request for her. And so he admits that he's a virgin as well, and so they have sex and it's beautiful and they want to be together forever. And so despite receiving the order that he has to kill her, he doesn't have the heart to do so. Now, this eventually works out, but after this episode, he just starts banging women left, right, and center. All of a sudden, he's this Casanova who uses his looks and ding-dong schlong in order to create this league of women for his harem. And it's just like so disconnected from the first episode. And on top of that, his wife is just completely okay with this. Like the first episode portrays their love as true and amazing, and then the next moment he's the dragon and she's the tiger, and they're married, but they're also independent. And that's cool and all, but what happened to create this full 180? At the start of the series, his wife is like, I want to have your babies, Freeman. Let these tigers that you're tattooing on my boobies signify that. But then she's okay with her hobby, like busting a nut into random women. I I just don't get it. I mean, I would be fine if they ended up that way, but there was no character development to justify this stark change, and that made it really awkward. Like, there are so many of these weird things that I just decided not to take a memo of because I just constantly be writing whilst watching this show. Besides Crying Freeman, I also watched this 40-minute OVA called 1919, which was created by Madhouse in 1990. And it's about a 19-year-old guy called Kubota who is looking to find a girlfriend as well as looking to lose his virginity. Now, the anime has a really poor start. Kubota works as a waiter at a restaurant, and one of the first things that happens at the restaurant is his boss feeling up his ass like it's nothing. So then you start to feel kind of bad for Kubota, but that then immediately disappears when this music segment starts up in which he just randomly tries to pick up women on the street and starts harassing them to the point that a female police officer stops by and he starts harassing her. Like, yeah, clearly Kubota is just down bad. He's gotten desperate to the point where he doesn't even really care anymore for love. He just wants to find some random nice girl to hook up with. So while he's being like, the sad boy at a club, he meets Fujisaka, who turns out to be his first love, actually, from like a couple of years back. So Kubota finds out that she has just broken up with her boyfriend of 5 years and figures that this is just the perfect chance for him to start dating her. Because, what could go wrong? A woman who just came out of a 5-year relationship, you can instantly start dating her, right? Yeah, this anime was painfully mediocre. The characters were also unlikable, and the entire plot was really boring and predictable. I will say, though, that the biggest thing that it had going for itself was the music. It was very fun, very 80s, kind of reminded me of George Michael in a way. Also, another fun thing was that they actually managed to get a hold of, the Boys, Boys, Boys song by Sabrina Salerno, and they played it during the nightclub scene. And I don't know, I kind of like watching these very obscure 80s and 90s anime and just having banger 80s music to bop to. So that was very cool. But honestly, I'm just here grasping at straws at this point. In conclusion, I would just not recommend this story because he ends up trying to hook up with this girl, and then obviously her ex-boyfriend comes in, and then it goes awry, and it's just kind of predictable, as I said. But yeah, back in episode 5, I spoke about reading Matsumoto Taiyo's dystopian manga series called Number 5. And while looking into Matsumoto's work, I found on his Mal page that he did the character design for a movie called Inu-Oh that came out this year, I think. Yeah, this year. And yeah, I saw the trailer and I was just really excited to give it a watch. But unfortunately, up until now, it hasn't been really accessible where I live, at least. There are viewings in movies, but movie theaters, but there hasn't been, I don't know, a DVD release yet. But yeah, I did find out that it's going to get released in December, which is when I'm posting this podcast. So I'll probably have watched it already once this is kind of like live. And so yeah, I just thought I'd give people, I don't know, like a heads up who might also be interested in giving this movie a go. So the main characters of this movie are Inu-Oh and Tomona. Inu-Oh was actually born with very unique physical characteristics, and his parents are horrified by this and decide to cover his body in garments, and they also use a mask to cover his entire face. Now, Tomona is a blind biwa player. A biwa is a traditional Japanese lute. And at some point, Inu-Oh and Tomona meet, which leads to Inu-Oh discovering that he has a talent for dancing. And the two decide to become business partners and also, of course, friends. And so we follow along as these two characters who have kind of been left at the fringes of society. We follow along as they start gaining notoriety for their talents. There are trailers available on YouTube, so I will leave links to those in the description box below. I am personally very excited for this movie. The animation, from what I've seen from the trailers, also looks really good. Moving on, I read the first volume of Kumichou Musume to Sewagakari by Tsukiya. The English title is The YAKUZA'S Guide to Babysitting, which kind of sounds like a mix of Gakuen Babysitters and The Way of the House Husband, which, funnily enough, is quite an accurate description of this manga. The story is about a 28-year-old guy called Kirishima Toru, and his nickname is the Demon of Sakuragi. So he's part of the Yakuza, and in particular, he's like the right hand of the Sakuragi branch of the Yakuza. Kirishima's boss has a daughter called Yaeka, and after spending some time living with her aunt, she's returning home. At the same time, Kirishima's boss feels that Kirishima lacks a sense of responsibility and therefore gives him the task of babysitting Yaeka. This was surprisingly a really fun story. I think the thing that I enjoyed the most was discovering Kirishima's character and seeing his relationship with Yaeka develop. On the outside, Kirishima comes off as kind of careless and as a rough person, but from interactions with Yaeka, we get to see how kind-hearted he actually is, or at least when it comes to his family, or, you know, his Yakuza family. Also, at the start of the volume, Yaeka is very cold towards him, and he tries his best to win her over. And as he's doing so, he finds that he himself is changing and turning into a more considerate and caring person. So I do know that the anime adaptation of this manga came out this year when I was like really focusing on, you know, my studies. So I'm actually really excited to give that a watch soon. I think that's everything I have to say about this manga. Moving on, it seems that Viz is trying their best to, you know, make an effort to get more of Ume's Kazuo's work in English for like their perfect edition line. Kazuo Ume's is one of the OGs of horror manga, and despite being so incredibly influential, he doesn't really have that many works available now in English. So yeah, Viz started bringing out his work under their perfect edition line a couple of years back. I think maybe like 4 or 5. They started with The Drifting Classroom, which is one of his best known horror / science fiction pieces. And now they are working on bringing out Orochi. I'm not too sure if they finished, but I think they're on part 4, like volume 4. I think they're about to publish, which means that they've essentially like concluded that story. But yeah, the manga itself, Orochi, is an anthology that centers around this very mysterious lady called Orochi. And as you continue to read the manga, you find that she has all these weird types of powers, such as the ability to alter people's memories, spy on others using paintings, and resurrecting people. Orochi seems to be wandering throughout Japan and randomly finds people who are in distress. So I read the first volume, and in that one, it seems that her intentions are good as she actually tries to help the people she meets. But I found myself wondering at the end of the volume whether or not she did more harm than good. The first story is about two teenage sisters, 17-year-old Emi and 16-year-old Rumi. The sisters are part of the Ryujin family, and apparently the women from this family are cursed with being incredibly beautiful when they're young, but when they turn 18, they instantly lose this beauty, essentially turning into kind of like life-sized gremlins. And so as both of their birthdays are getting closer and closer, they become more and more distressed. The second story is about a woman who had a very hard life but was a true natural beauty. Eventually, she marries this regular guy and they have a nice life together until he gets hit by a car. He's badly wounded but survives and is expected to need 3 years or so in order to recover. However, his recovery is going very speedy, and so when he decides to go for a walk for the first time since the accident, he ends up dying for real. And this makes his wife incredibly sad, and that's when Orochi tries to help her, I think. I do want to mention how freaking goofy that second story was. So as the husband is about to go out for a walk, his wife is just like, please be careful, watch out for cars. And so the husband goes, don't worry about it. It's not like I'll get hit by a car again. And then the next panel says, but that day her husband slipped, fell from a cliff, and died. Like, how did that escalate so quickly? Anyway, I thought that was really funny, but other than that, there really wasn't much of, I don't know how to say it, like classic Ume's humor in his story, because I've actually read quite a couple of his work since for a while now I've been working on a video discussing some of his most popular work. And so when comparing Orochi to the other works that I've read of his, I can say that this is definitely my least favorite piece. To be fair though, I've only read the first volume, so who knows, I might warm up to the series when I'm like reading the rest of it, but I don't know, I just don't think that I like Orochi as a character that much. She seems to be rather careless with her powers, which largely contributes to the worsened predicament the people she comes across to get into. And at some point during that first volume, it got kind of annoying to me. Anyway, yeah, there's still volume 2, 3, and 4. So if I end up reading those, I'll talk about them again in the podcast in like a future episode. So about an episode or two ago, I talked about how Uguisu Sachiko's latest manga came to an end and that I bought the third and last volume and would review the series once I finished reading everything. And I have since done so, and I have some thoughts. But before I get into that, let me just quickly take the time to recap what the story is about. Yeah, I forgot to mention the title of the manga. It's Tokimeki no Ikenie. There's this girl called Mari who has dreams of becoming a mangaka. She also has a crush on the cutest guy in school called Hanamizuki, and one day on her way home, she finds him laying on the road after being in a hit and run. She manages to save his life by calling an ambulance, and so when he gets back to school, he asks her out. However, she declines. not because she doesn't like him anymore. It's actually because her family is part of a cult which is led by the prophecies of Nostradamus. Nostradamus, by the way, was a 16th century French astrologist who made like a bunch of predictions about the future. Anyway, the cult believes that they have to make blood sacrifices in order to save humanity from ruin and bring peace. The most important rule, therefore, in Mari's family is to stay as removed as possible from society, so falling in love clearly is not an option. Besides this, her father was planning to make her the head of the family, so there would be no way she could even start to date Hana Mitsuki. So that's the basic premise of the manga. Besides this, there are all sorts of other things that are getting in the way of Mari's goals of just having a normal life. For instance, there's this secretly deranged it girl at school who wants to kill her because Hana Mitsuki likes Mari more than he likes her. Mari also has a little brother who happens to also want to kill her because he wants their older brother to be the head of the family instead. After reading the first couple of chapters, I was really excited about the story because it's just super wacky and unique because it's essentially a horror rom-com manga, and I just loved that idea. Having this fun mix of intense shoujo romance panels and that then being juxtaposed with people getting chopped up. I just thought that was really refreshing and cool. But then when I got to the third volume, the pacing was just at breakneck speed. And I think that basically was... Well, I have suspicions that this series was just axed because, like I said, the pacing was just completely different from the other two volumes. So in the third volume, we randomly get introduced to this guy who got set on fire by the cult and whose fiancée they also kidnapped so that Mari's family could use her for, like one of their blood sacrifice how would you call that, rituals. Yeah, so the man is a former cop and he sets out with two other guys to kill the entire family. They end up massacring almost everyone in the house, but when Mari's hands get stained by the blood of her dying little brother, she kind of like goes into this weird trance, after which she becomes this intensely powerful goddess, essentially. So she ends up killing the murderers by telekinetics, or I don't know, she telekinetically rips them into pieces. And then in the end, she and her older brother, who wasn't at the house at the time, end up being the only survivors of her family. Her brother then tells her that according to a prophecy, she is now the queen of terror and the fate essentially of humanity now lies in her hands. The manga then ends with the potential of her getting closer to Hana Mitsuki as well as her pursuing her dreams to become a mangaka. So actually, before I finished reading the entire series, I went to Mal and saw some of the few comments that were left there, about the series. They were all negative, and one of them actually spoiled the ending. And usually I don't mind the ending being spoiled because I feel that if the story is good, I will still enjoy it regardless. However, after reading the spoiler, I couldn't help but feel kind of disappointed. And at first I thought it was because I got spoiled, but I think I've now come to realize that it was because I just didn't like the ending. Finishing the series and being able to sit with that for some time made that very clear for me as well. I feel that the things that eventually happened at the end of the series just came out of left field. The ending was basically, everyone dies and now Mari can live a happy life. The end. And I think this kind of stuff would have worked for Uguisu's short work, where it's not surprising when things all of a sudden escalate very quickly. However, in a long form work like this, I can't help but feel very unsatisfied with the ending. Like, for instance, the rivalry that existed between Mari and, the It Girl never really reaches a showdown or a boiling point, but rather when the girl goes to Mari's house, she finds Mari's family massacred and runs away. Anyway, I'm still not too sure how exactly to feel about the story. I don't know, like, I'm just feeling a bit ambivalent about it. Maybe, well, not indifferent, because I strongly enjoyed the start and just the ending was missing something. I felt that the story could have like continued a bit longer. I would have loved to see that showdown between Mari and the It Girl as well, but it is what it is, and yeah, that's about it. I also read this collection called AX Alternative Manga, which was edited by Sean Michael Wilson. It's this huge 400-page collection of manga that appeared in AX, which is one of the like best known magazines to publish, I guess, experimental alternative manga. I figured I'd give it a go since there might be some hidden gems here and there, and this was such a mixed bag. Every story was like a big hit or miss for me, but I ended up finding some really cool mangakas, so I'm overall quite happy with having picked up this manga or like manga collection. So yeah, starting off, I would first like to explain as to why some of these were just huge misses for me. A lot of these pieces were so abstract that I had a really hard time understanding what the heck was going on in these stories. So to give you an example, there's this one manga in which a guy who has a knife lodged in the back of his skull is snoring loudly on the street. There's another man who, from his home, spots the man and watches him intensively. Then a dog passes by and pisses on this dude's face, but he still doesn't wake up. In fact, he starts snoring even more loudly. And that's when the guy in the house tries to record the snoring with his microphone and then asks his wife to take off her clothes and dance. So she does this, and the man gives her a 10 out of 10 rating. The end. Like, what even was that? Like, it was so incredibly confusing, So there are a lot of these weird type of stories in here that I just couldn't enjoy because I didn't understand, I guess, the mangaka's intent, perhaps. And I would really say that the majority of these stories were actually like this. Some were actually far too vile for me to even mention here. I like to think that I can stomach quite a lot, but when it comes to things like sexual degeneracy or like, I don't know, defiance or whatever, I'm just really not interested in that at all. But yeah, there were also others, that were just super wacky and out of this world. For instance, there's this one story about this woman who gives birth to 5 puppies. The first 3 died after a while because the woman didn't have enough milk to nourish them all. The other 2 survive, and they end up getting raised as regular humans, which most people think is kind of super weird. And then they manage to enter public school, but the other kids there in their class start to complain that the dogs smell like dogs. So the principal calls the parents in and he's like, yeah, like this isn't really working. And whilst they're trying to talk things out, they get alerted that one of their sons has just been lynched. Which is like, what? Like how did we get here? Like how did we get to this point? So the father naturally is livid, so he starts questioning the kids to find out who killed his son. And then there's this one kid who points out how, the dog isn't human anyways. So the dad gets like super pissed. He drags the boy by his shirt and he tells him to cool his head off a bit and literally yeets him all the way to the South Pole. Like, how? Like, anyway, years later, the remaining dog son gets mauled by another dog, and so all of the couple's dogs or children have now passed away. However, then the lady says that she's pregnant again, and this time they are so desperate for her just to have a human child. And so the man puts his ear to her belly and then he hears meow. Like, I don't even know if the manga has like some sort of deeper meaning or whatever, but this was quite ridiculous. But yeah, it did give me a good laugh, so I guess there's that. But I did find some amazing mangaka through this collection. For instance, this artist called Yamamoto Takato, he calls his art style Heisei aestheticism, and he draws inspiration from ukiyo-e, which is a traditional Japanese woodblock art, manga, and contemporary gothic horror. Women are at the center of his work, and I've got to say that I really enjoy his aesthetics. His manga that is featured in this volume is about a woman who's been killed and is just starting to realize that she's dead or dying at the moment that the gravedigger is covering her up. So yes, that was kind of morbid, but I really liked the gothic vibes to the story, which were very strong. And I also thought it was very interesting how the manga kind of read more like a novel than, I don't know, what you'd normally expect from a manga. There was also this really neat manga by Kawai Katsuo, and it was about a lady who had been cheated on. Her boyfriend tells her that he's leaving her for another woman and apologizes, saying that he can't know how much he has hurt her. The lady then takes out a box of hundreds of metal drawing pins and starts pinning them to his back, while he keeps telling her how that pain doesn't amount to the pain that he has put her through. Eventually, his entire back is shiny metal like the scales of an amphibian, and that's when he starts for the door where his new lover is already waiting for him. As the two walk away, his, I guess, mistress uses a spoon to pull out all of the pins, leaving this really long trail of drawing pins. And this is the moment when the ex-girlfriend says that she thought about chasing him, but in order to do so, she would have to walk on that path of pins. And she reckons that it was easy to see that doing so would hurt her far more than, the pain she was in when she and her ex-boyfriend were living together. And, I just thought that was a really neat story. I don't know, I just really thought the symbolism was very interesting. Anyway, another mangaka I discovered through this collection was Komatsu Shinya. He creates josei and seinen slice of life manga, often within the genre of fantasy. What makes his manga so unique is that it looks like it's made for kids. And I find that dichotomy to be quite appealing. So I would love to try out one of his works, though I have yet to decide which one that's going to be. There's this seinen called Tsurumaki Machi Natsujikan, which translates to summertime in Tsurumaki. This one centers around a boy in primary school called Mitsuru who has the ability to talk to plants. He ends up watering a water hyacinth in his classroom that was neglected. I think you say hyacinth. Anyway, this sets off a series of strange events that take place during the summer in Mitsuru's town. Then there's also this other one I've been considering, and it's this josei called Gogo no Akubi, which translates to afternoon yawn. This one centers around an office worker called Hibino Awaka, and she lives in a town called Shiratama where just very strange things occur. Both of them are characterized as very relaxing, slice of life manga, which I think perfectly fits the art style. In any case, I'll be sure to discuss any of his works I end up reading on the podcast here. Moving on to some darker stuff, I recently read this manga called Toresu, or just Trace, and this was created by Kogake. A quick content note here, the next two manga I discuss contain DVSA murder because they deal with crime, so if you don't want to hear all of that, you can skip to about 1 hour, 2 minutes and 35 seconds. So Trace focuses on a forensic laboratory of the Tokyo Police Department. One of the main characters is Sawaguchi Nonna, who is a rookie forensic researcher in her second year. She gets assigned to work with Mano Reiji, a 31-year-old forensic researcher who is one of the best and most diligent professionals in his field. Reiji, however, has a tragic past. 23 years ago, when as an 8-year-old he came back from school, he walked into his living room to find his father, mother, and sister dead in their own pools of blood. The cops who were at the scene found his older brother hung from a doorknob on the first floor with a suicide note, basically implicating him in the murders. Reiji, however, believes that the real killer is still out there, and so he's working towards the day of retribution. This is a very good manga in my opinion. The setup is that every couple of chapters, the forensic laboratory works on a criminal case, and during all that, the manga just continuously explains all of the things that they're actually doing. Like it's explaining the specifics pertaining to, the forensic work that they're performing. So essentially, it's a forensics manga intertwined with a murder mystery. I have to say though that it was very jarring and confronting at times to read this manga. This is because it doesn't shy away from anything within criminal forensics. The first couple of chapters already contain SA, DV, incest, and just a bunch of morally debased criminals. So I would definitely cautiously recommend this manga. Personally, one of the things that I found to be interesting was actually the ethics concerning being a forensic researcher. You have to look into all these complicated cases and also at the same time ensure that your state of mind and your reasoning is in such a place where you can actually perform your job to the best of your ability. It just seems like such an incredibly difficult job to do mentally. But yeah, getting more into the stories, I really liked the characters. I thought that they were written very well. The story is mostly written from the perspective of Nonna, and it's done in such a way that it's like we're learning about forensics the same time that she is. As for the authenticity of the manga, I don't know much myself about forensics, but I did get the impression that at the very least, quite a lot of time and effort has been put into trying to get all the information and procedures to be accurate in the manga. So I managed to finish the first 2 volumes, but it's honestly really tasking to read this manga in Japanese because the subject matter is very niche, and so a lot of jargon, thus very uncommon words, get used during the manga. So yeah, I thought it was really tasking for me, emotionally, but also on just the basic level of trying to understand what was going on. In any case, I do think I'll get back to this manga in a couple of months or so, because I'm going to be living in Japan and studying Japanese there, so I feel that by, I don't know, maybe March, April or something, this reading these types of manga will be a lot easier. And yes, when that time comes, I will report back on this podcast. Okay, I've told you about Trace, and the whole reason as to how I found that manga was because I first stumbled upon its spin-off called Brutaru Satsujin Kansatsukan no Kokuhaku. The English translation is Brutal Confessions of a Homicide Investigator. I found this story about a year ago, I believe, as I was trying to look for some josei horror, and it seemed, or at least according to Mal, which actually I don't think is true, but anyways, it seemed that this was the only, I guess, josei horror that at the time was being serialized. But yeah, a year has passed since, and it hasn't been completed yet, but it has been put on hiatus for, I think, about 9 months now, because the mangaka who's doing this, which is actually not like the original of Trace, their name is Izawa, they are dealing with some health issues. But yeah, this manga is set about 12 to 13 years before Trace, and it centers around homicide detective Dan Hiroki. At the time, he's about 30 years old, and he's the head of the first division of the police department that deals with homicides. Aside from being a detective, he also happens to be a serial killer. The thing that he enjoys the most is to find criminals or bad people and kill them in very creative ways, so to speak. Oftentimes, these people are those who are actually quite difficult to prosecute, such as, for instance, a serial abuser who comes from a very influential family that covers up their crimes. So this manga is quite episodical in the way that there isn't this main story that you watch unfold over time. Every couple of chapters deal with one criminal case, which in the end reaches some sort of resolution. And so these stories are actually quite interchangeable. In any case, one of the things that I think is very appealing about this manga, specifically for those who are fans of Trace, is that it offers an insight to the psyche of Detective Dan, which, considering his role in the original manga, really enriches the story. I do have to say so that this is one of the most messed up manga I have read. I think even like the most, maybe, because there are just points where I was reading the manga and I was just dry heaving because of what I was seeing on the panels. I mean, compared to this, most of Ito Junji's work is like a walk in a park. This manga gets really, really gruesome. And that's the funny thing. It really surprises me that basically the most gruesome manga I've read happens to be a josei manga. But yeah, going back to the story, the crimes that these criminals commit are horrific, like the most degenerate type of murder, SADV, and the way Detective Dan tortures these people is so sadistic, yet very poetic. By the way, he isn't motivated by revenge, actually. Rather, he has kind of like this thirst for seeing the face of utter hopelessness and desperation, which he always captures with a Polaroid camera and keeps in a special photo album. So to give you an idea of his practices, I'd like to take the first story, which I personally felt to be one of the strongest, as an example. So this one concerns the criminal case of a teenager who killed and dismembered 2 toddlers, which he then sent back to their respective parents in a box after they started to decompose. Partly due to him being a teenager at the time, he only gets sentenced to jail for 20 years. And so after his release, he decides to strike up a huge book deal for a book in which he describes his motives and the whole psychology behind the crimes that he committed. In public, he acts like he's remorseful, but in reality, he really doesn't care, and he still finds it very funny that he sent his victims back to their parents. Now, Dan manages to kidnap him and takes him to this remote cottage that he owns, like up in the hills or something. And that is the place where Dan ends up dismembering him, then patching up his wounds to show the criminal how he now looks like, and then proceeds to show him a Christmas tree he made out of this dude's limbs. Afterwards, he burns him alive in the kiln that he also happens to use to fire up his, I guess, adorably ugly pottery. Yeah, so an interesting thing about this manga is that despite it being like incredibly twisted, it also has like a good bit of humor to it, and yeah, I can see why it might like appeal to women, or why it's being like brought out in a josei manga. Because yes, Detective Dan might be a sadistic serial killer, but on the other hand, you know, he likes to make cute mugs with bunnies on it. He's also he's also really handsome, and he loves animals and kids. So, you know, I mean, just this juxtaposition of creating this character that clearly appeals to like all the women, you know, handsome and loving and very, you know, like just kind of like quote unquote husband material, but also at the same time, he's just a deranged serial killer. And trust me, there are so many women thirsting over him online. But you know, that's something that I really like about this manga, just the sheer like juxtaposition that it, you know, shows essentially. I would also like to note that this manga did get me worked up at times, because essentially all these crimes also happen in real life, and the idea of actual real people committing them and just getting away with these is just purely sickening. And so often at, you know, the start of a new story, of a new crime essentially, I would feel myself get a bit like emotional or disturbed, but then those feelings slowly started to dissipate, and I was kind of like getting this, how would you say, this kind of like sick satisfaction of getting to see these criminals get what's coming to them. So the last thing that I wanted to say about this manga is that it isn't all that realistic. Like, there are ways in which Detective Dan as a serial killer operates, like the way he's able to do all these things by himself, as well as the ways in which he obtains information. And yeah, all of these things are just not explained, and so you're kind of like left on your own to, I guess, fill in the blanks, or you could, just like I did, go along with it and just enjoy the ride. But yeah, other than that, I think that both of these manga are really great, and I feel that they complement each other very well, and I'm looking forward to reading more of both of these. Now, I also read 2 manga that just recently started getting serialized on the Manga Plus website of Shueisha. One is called Shin Tokyo. The official translation is Tokyo Underworld, and it's created by Sakaki Kenji. The synopsis speaks of an urban legend about a place called Tokyo Underworld. This supposedly is an alternate Tokyo where people who are guilty of pushing others towards suicide are brought. Then in that place, they will face judgment by being killed by a so-called watcher. That is all I knew going into the manga, but it was enough to, at the very least, pique my interest. I ended up reading everything that was available at Manga Plus at the time, which were the first 6 chapters. It turns out that this story centers around 2 twins in high school called Yomi and Yami, and they have twin synchronicity, which is this thing where you feel what the other twin is feeling. Now, these twins like many other shonen main characters have a tragic backstory. Apparently, they lost their parents 5 years ago. In any case, their high school teacher is constantly getting bullied by some of the kids in their class, and Yomi and Yami try to stand up for him, while other students just kind of let it happen in fear of getting bullied themselves. Now, one day they go on a trip to Tokyo Tower, and as they're on their way back home, the teacher holds this whole speech about how he's going to condemn all the kids in his class to Tokyo Underworld by committing suicide because he's been bullied for years upon years, and now that he's about to retire, he's not really liking the prospect of, dying alone of old age. So yeah, he drinks a bottle of, I guess, something that has pesticide in it, and he dies in front of all the kids. And so Yomi and Yami's entire class gets sent to Tokyo Underworld. And here is my first issue with this manga. The whole thing is that people get sent to this place because they pushed someone to commit suicide. But like, bruh, how are you going to hold the entire class responsible? Like, this teacher literally blamed some 16-year-olds for not stopping other kids from bullying him, and even sent Yomi and Yami to the underworld, to Tokyo Underworld, because apparently their efforts to stop the bullying wasn't enough, even though they themselves got hurt in the process. Like, where was this teacher when they got hurt, I'm just saying, it felt kind of cheap having, these good guy protagonists, but then also making sure that they go to a place where actually only people who do really awful things are supposed to go to. Anyway, moving on, they're now all in Tokyo Underworld, and they have to deal with their first so-called watcher. So this is like the entity that is trying to execute them. Now the students, however, get just a slither of hope when they're told that if they manage to beat all the watchers they need to beat, that they will receive mercy and they can go back home. And so the 6th chapter ends with the students beating the first watcher despite having suffered major losses. In my opinion, this manga is wholly unoriginal. The challenges the students face in the underworld get broadcast as a TV show, and there's also this board of pictures of the 40 students where a picture loses its light when the student on it gets killed or just plainly dies. This isn't much different from any other, we need to do this challenge otherwise we'll die type of story. It's giving Osama Game, Squid Game, Hunger Games vibes, and not in a very good way. Like, there's, for instance, one thing that really irked me was like the just really gross type of fan service that was in this manga. Like, at some point, there's literally a panty shot of a high schooler pissing herself out of sheer terror. And I'm just like, why did we need to see this? Also, aside from that, the main characters are, your typical try-hard shonen protagonist, and it just makes the entire manga very corny, in my opinion. But yeah, let's just move on from this manga. The other one that I read was Fuji no Yamai wa Fushi no Yamai. The English title is The Dog Doctor, Ikuru, and it's created by Hechi. The story is set in a world riddled with disease. Apparently, at some point, some type of comet or whatever flew over the earth and added over 100 million new diseases to the 30,000 that were already present. In this world, we follow Dark Dr. Ikuru, who uses his own disease of immortality to cure people. What happens is that when a new disease is introduced into Ikuru's body, it gets fought off with his blood becoming an antidote. So essentially, he's curing people using his own disease. Although important to note that the cured people don't get infected with his immortality, since apparently it's not a congenital disease. So I really like the art style of the manga, but other than that, I don't really have much good to say about the manga. Also, nothing really bad either. It's just very inoffensive, and in that way, it's rather disappointing. So yeah, both of them didn't really tickle my fancy. And so we've basically reached the final segment of this podcast, which is Ask an Otaku. If you have an otaku related question you would like to ask me, leave it in the comment section below with the hashtag #AskAnOtaku, and I'll try and answer it in any of the future podcast episodes. As I'm recording this video, I don't have any questions to answer, so that's the end of the podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening and or watching, and I hope to see you soon in another episode. Take care. Cheers.